The most dangerous wrath isn't the one that screams, but the one that waits patiently in the silence for the perfect moment. Experience the gripping tales of calculated revenge and the ultimate price of betrayal. Subscribe now and watch the silent storm finally break on screen.
Not because I was the loudest one at family dinners. Not because I had the most opinions, or the sharpest tongue, or the kind of personality that filled a room before I even sat down. I was the one people called when something needed to get done. When my brother needed a cosigner on his apartment lease at 22 because his credit was non-existent, I signed. When his car got repossessed 6 months later and he needed someone to drive him to job interviews, I rearranged my work schedule for 3 weeks. That was just how it was between us. That was just who I was in this family. My name is Celeste. I'm 31 years old. I work in corporate logistics, which sounds boring and is, mostly, but it pays well, and it taught me how to manage a lot of moving parts at once without losing my mind. I'm organized. I make lists. I follow through. These are not glamorous qualities, but they are useful ones, and for most of my adult life, my family has found them extremely useful. My brother's name is Eli. He's 28, 3 years younger than me, which means I spent a decent portion of my childhood being told to watch out for him, set an example, be patient because he's still learning. I was patient. For years and years, I was patient. I want to be clear about that, because the way things ended, some people in my family tried to tell the story like I was always cold, always calculating, always just waiting for a reason to pull the rug out. That's not what happened. What happened is that I helped him for so long that he forgot it was help. It just became the baseline. It became what I was for. About 2.5 years ago, Eli told me he wanted to open a restaurant, not a big one. A small place, he said. Neighborhood spot. He'd been cooking seriously since his early 20s, had worked in 2 different commercial kitchens, had a clear idea of the concept. Southern-influenced comfort food, counter service, build-your-own bowls, the kind of thing that works in a mid-sized city if the location is right and the branding is clean. He had a business plan. He had a vision board. What he didn't have was money. He came to me in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, sat down at my table with a printed folder and a cup of coffee I'd made him, and he laid it all out. He needed $45,000 to cover the lease deposit, equipment, initial inventory, permits, and enough runway to survive the first 3 months before revenue stabilized. He had $12,000 saved. He needed the rest. I asked him every question I could think of. Location scouted? Yes. Lease terms reviewed? He had a lawyer friend looking at it. Projected monthly costs? He had a spreadsheet. I read through everything twice. It wasn't a perfect plan. No plan for a first restaurant ever is. But it was serious. He'd done real work on it. And he was my brother, so I said yes. I gave him $33,000, my own savings, money I'd put away since my mid-20s for something I hadn't decided on yet. I didn't frame it as a loan. I told him it was an investment, and if the restaurant made money, I'd take a small percentage until the principal was recovered, and if it didn't, then we'd figure it out. I was not naive about the risk. I just believed in him, and I thought that meant something. For the first year, things were good. The restaurant opened, he called it Briarwood, which I thought was a beautiful name. And the first few months were genuinely hard, the way first months always are. But by month 5, they had regulars. By month 8, they had a line on weekend mornings. I went every chance I could. I told everyone I knew. I sat at the counter sometimes and just watched my brother work and felt proud in a way that's hard to put into words. I was also still helping. Not with money at that point, mostly with everything else. I helped him negotiate with a supplier when they tried to change his terms mid-contract. I stayed up until midnight more than once helping him write job postings when staff turned over. I drove to the restaurant on a Tuesday evening in January because his bookkeeper had made an error, and he needed a second set of eyes on the numbers before the end of the month. I did all of this because I wanted to. Because it was my brother's dream, and I was part of making it real. Then things shifted. I noticed it slowly, the way you notice a room getting colder. Not because someone opened a window dramatically, just because the temperature dropped a few degrees at a time until you realize you've been sitting in a cold room for a while. Eli started being harder to reach. Not unreachable, just delayed. He'd respond to texts a day later than he used to. He'd cancel plans more. When I did see him, there was something slightly guarded in the way he talked about the restaurant. He'd give me general updates instead of the specifics he used to share. Business is good. Things are moving. We're looking at some new stuff. I told myself he was busy. He was. Running a restaurant is a full-time life, not just a full-time job. I gave him space. About 8 months ago, he called me on a Thursday evening. I remember the day because I'd just gotten home from a particularly long work trip and I was sitting on my couch with my shoes still on, too tired to move. He said he had some exciting news. They were expanding. Not opening a second location, but a significant renovation, adding a small bar program, extending the dining room into a space next door that had just become available. He said it was the right move. The timing was perfect. The landlord was being cooperative. He sounded like himself again, excited and clear-eyed and full of plans. I asked how he was financing it. He paused. And in that pause, I felt something shift. He said he'd already handled it, had worked out a small business loan and brought in a second investor. He said it pretty casually, like it was a footnote. I said, "That's great," and I meant it. But I also said, "You brought in a second investor?" And he said, "Yeah, just someone who wanted a stake. It made sense for the growth stage." I asked who. He said a name I didn't know. A friend, he said. Someone he'd met through the industry. I said okay, and congratulations, and we talked for a few more minutes about the renovation timeline, and I hung up feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not hurt exactly. Not yet. More like a small, persistent unease. The kind you try to reason yourself out of. I did something I probably shouldn't have, which is that I looked into it. I'm organized, remember. I know how to find information when I need to. I looked up the business registration, which is public record. I looked at the updated ownership structure. My name was not on it. I had been removed. At some point in the last several months, the documentation had been updated and my original investment, which had been listed as a percentage stake in the business, had been reclassified. It was listed now as a gift. No ownership interest attached. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest here. My first reaction was not anger. It was that hollow, slightly nauseating feeling of realizing something has been true for a while before you actually saw it. Like finding out the floor you'd been standing on had a crack in it the whole time. I called him, he didn't answer. I texted him and said we needed to talk, it was important. He texted back 2 hours later and said he was in the middle of the renovation prep. Can it wait until the weekend? I said I'd seen the updated business registration. He called me back in 4 minutes. The conversation that followed was one of the most disorienting I've ever had with anyone, let alone my own brother. He was immediately on the defensive in a way that told me he'd been expecting this call for a while and had prepared for it. He said the reclassification was a legal necessity because of how the new investors' terms were structured, that having 2 different classes of ownership interest was complicated, that he'd meant to talk to me about it, but there was never a good time, that it didn't change how he felt about my contribution to the business. He said my contribution was founding level. He said he thought of me as essential to what Briarwood was. I asked him plainly, do I have any ownership interest in this business? He said technically, in terms of the legal structure, no. But I said that was all I needed to know. He kept talking. He said the new investor had required a clean cap table, that it was standard, that he should have handled it differently, but he'd been under so much pressure. He said he was sorry. He said he'd pay me back. He was planning to. It would just take some time, like it was a favor I'd done him. Like $33,000 was something you paid back when you got around to it. I said I needed some time to think and I got off the phone. I didn't call him for 2 weeks. He texted 3 times, each one a little more anxious than the last. I read them all and didn't respond. I wasn't playing games. I genuinely needed space to figure out what I was feeling and what I wanted to do, because the answer was not obvious to me. Part of me wanted to let it go. This is your brother. This is Briarwood. You were there the day he signed the lease. You've been to that restaurant so many times. The staff knows your order. You don't want to burn this down. But another part of me was paying attention to something else. Something I'd been quietly observing for years without letting myself fully register it. The apartment, the car, the job interviews, the late nights with the spreadsheets. 12 years of being the one who showed up, who didn't ask for much, who trusted him to treat that generosity with care. And what he had done, in the end, was see my trust as an opportunity. I called my cousin Vera, who is a paralegal, and I explained the situation. She listened very carefully, and then she asked me a specific question. Did I have any documentation from the original investment? The original ownership percentage, the terms, anything in writing? I did. When Eli and I had structured the investment, I'd insisted on a simple written agreement. He'd teased me about it. Very on brand, Celeste, very you, and I'd smiled and said, I know, just humor me. We both signed it. I had the original. Vera said that document was significant. She said the reclassification without my consent was not as clean as whoever advised him seemed to think. She said I had options. I want to be clear that I did not make my next move out of anger. I was past anger by then. I was in something quieter and more deliberate. I reached out to the new investor directly, not to blow anything up, just to inform him that there was an existing ownership agreement that had not been properly dissolved and that he might want to verify the legal standing of his own investment before proceeding further with the renovation. ICC, Eli. The response was immediate. Within an hour, Eli was calling me, then texting. Then my mother called, which told me he'd gone to her, which told me he was scared. My mother left me a voicemail that was equal parts confused and upset, saying Eli was beside himself, saying why couldn't we just talk like family, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this. I texted my mother back and said I was happy to talk. I asked if she knew what Eli had done with my money. I sent her a photo of the original agreement and a photo of the updated business registration side by side. She didn't respond for 3 hours. When she did, she said, I didn't know about any of that. I believed her. Eli called me that evening, and this time I answered. He was not defensive anymore. That had burned off somewhere in the hours between my email to his investor and this phone call. He was scared, and underneath the fear he was ashamed, and I could hear it, and it was one of the harder things I've had to sit with because he is still my brother, and that has not stopped meaning something. But I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to undo it because his voice sounded the way it did. He said he was sorry. He said it several times in different ways, and some of it sounded real. He asked me what I wanted. I told him exactly what I wanted. I wanted my original equity stake reinstated in writing with a proper legal document within 30 days. I wanted acknowledgement in that document that the original agreement had been valid and had not been properly dissolved. And I wanted a payment schedule in writing for the recovery of a portion of the principal over the next 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Okay. I said, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I want to hurt you or hurt the restaurant. I'm doing this because I deserve to be treated like a person who matters and not like a convenience. If you want me to be your sister going forward, this is what that looks like. He said he understood. It took closer to 6 weeks than 30 days, and there was one moment in the middle where his investor tried to push back through an attorney, and I sent Vera's analysis back with a calm, 1-paragraph note, and that resolved itself. But it happened. The agreement was signed. The equity stake was reinstated. The payment schedule was formalized. My mother and I talked about it properly eventually. A long phone call, one Sunday evening. She said she was glad I hadn't just walked away. She said she was proud of me, which she doesn't say often. She said she hoped Eli had learned something. I said I hope so too. Eli and I are not where we were. I don't know if we'll get back there. We talk, it's functional. There's a carefulness between us now that wasn't there before, which is sad. But I've stopped pretending that things were uncomplicated before this, because they weren't. They just looked uncomplicated, because I was absorbing the cost of the complications and not saying anything. I went to Briarwood last month for the first time since everything happened. A Saturday morning, busy, the way it always is on weekends. I sat at the counter, ordered what I always order. The staff greeted me the way they always have. My brother came out of the kitchen when someone told him I was there. He stood across the counter from me for a moment, and then he said, I'm glad you came. I said, me too. We didn't hug. We didn't have a movie moment. He went back to the kitchen and I finished my food and left. But I paid my bill, which I know sounds like nothing, but it meant something to me. I didn't eat for free because I'd helped build the place. I paid like a customer, like a person who chose to be there because she wanted to be, not because she owed it to anyone. That's the part I'm still working on, honestly. Understanding the difference between loving people and funding them. Between showing up because you want to and showing up because it's become expected. I'm not bitter about what I gave. I meant every dollar of it, and I meant every hour of it, and I would not go back and undo the years of being that person for my family. But I'm learning that generosity isn't the same thing as unconditional availability, that you can love someone completely and still require them to treat you with basic honesty. that these things are not in conflict, even when it feels like they are. Some days I still drive past the restaurant and feel that original pride, the first kind, clean and uncomplicated. The sign in the window, the line on a Saturday morning, my brother doing the thing he always said he wanted to do. I built part of that, I know I did. And now it's documented. I've thought a lot about the moment I handed Eli that check. Not with regret. I want to be clear about that. I've turned it over enough times now to know that the regret isn't where the lesson lives. The lesson lives somewhere quieter, in the space between who I was when I signed my name and who I had to become to get that signature on a proper document 2 years later. Here's what I've come to understand. When you keep giving without requiring anything in return, not gratitude, not honesty, not basic acknowledgement, you don't actually teach the people around you that you're generous. You teach them that you're available. Those are not the same thing, and the difference matters more than I knew when I was 26 and co-signing leases and rearranging my work schedule without being asked. Eli is not a bad person. I need to say that because it's true and because the easy version of the story, the one that feels satisfying to tell, is the one where he's the villain and I'm the victim, and that's the whole picture. But that's not accurate. What Eli did was make a series of choices that each felt small in the moment, delay the conversation, let the paperwork slide, reclassify what was mine without asking me, and those small choices accumulated into something that required a lawyer's letter to fix. That's not villainy. That's what happens when someone has learned over years and years that you will absorb the cost of their carelessness. I taught him that. Not intentionally. But I taught him. The part that took me the longest to sit with is this. I knew something was off long before I looked up the business registration. I felt that cooling, that distance, those guarded updates about things moving and new stuff happening. I noticed it, and I told myself he was just busy. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, the way I'd always given him the benefit of the doubt, because that's what you do, because he's family, because disrupting the peace felt harder than absorbing the discomfort quietly. That is not a virtue. I used to think it was. I used to think being easygoing and patient and low maintenance was the best kind of person to be in a family. Now I think it's a way of avoiding something harder, which is being honest in real time before things calcify, before someone has reclassified your investment on paper and brought in an outside attorney to protect their position. Vera, when I called her, didn't tell me to fight. She just told me what I had and what it meant. She gave me information and let me decide. And I think that's a form of respect that I hadn't been showing myself, taking my own situation seriously enough to actually look at it, document and all, instead of hoping it would resolve itself if I was patient enough. What I know now is that clarity is an act of care. Not anger, not revenge, not punishment, just clear, accurate accounting of what is real. I helped build Briarwood. That's documented now. And I am still Eli's sister. That part was never actually in question, even when it felt like it was. What we're both still learning, I think, is how to be family in a way that doesn't require one of us to disappear.